Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Phil Ponce on this Monday, November 11th. Coming up on the program, what the Arctic blast means for Chicago weather. A Black American Legion post celebrates 100 years. And get a poem from a gumball machine? We explain how. But first tonight, as former Los Angeles Police Chief Charlie Beck prepares to take over the top job at the Chicago Police Department, at least temporarily, his appointment is sounding an alarm for activists. Brandis Friedman has more on this story. Brandis.
So, Phil, we spoke today with one of the leading organizers of Black Lives Matter Chicago, and she says that the group has a number of problems with Mayor Lori Lightfoot appointing Charlie Beck to be the interim superintendent of police, starting with just that, the fact that he is appointed. They object that there is no democratic process for selecting the city's executive and board positions outside of the few in City Hall.
The fact that we don't have a democratic process in place for either of those things, from the police board to the superintendent to the Board of Education in Chicago, is symbolic of the way that autocratic control has kind of dominated the machine in the city.
Now, late last week, Mayor Lightfoot appointed Beck to serve as interim superintendent once Eddie Johnson leaves the office at the end of the year. But last week, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles wrote an open letter to Chicagoans that says basically, you don't want Beck. The group says under Beck, LAPD targeted black motorists at 5 times their population and searched them 3 times more than white drivers. They also say programming implemented under Beck created a culture of fear and perpetuated racial profiling. And Black Lives Matter LA and Chicago both expressed concern, particularly over the amount of police-involved shootings that happened on his watch.
Charlie Beck has a horrendous history of brutality in LA. He led the LA Police Department during one of their most murderous years, where over 47 people were killed by either directly by police or police-involved shootings, as well as in custody deaths. That's absolutely not something that we want in this city.
And to compare, just last week, Eddie Johnson told us that in 2011, police-involved shootings in Chicago were at a high of 91. So far this year, he says they are at 16 on-duty officers being involved in shootings, although Johnson and Black Lives Matter, Phil, they differ on who can take credit for that reduction.
So, Brandis, what else is known about Charlie Beck's tenure as police chief, and what's next for him here in Chicago?
So, when announcing his appointment last week, the mayor's office says that Beck's Community Safety Partnership Program reduced arrests and violent crime in communities where it was implemented, and that it also led to a higher homicide clearance rate. We also heard from another former interim superintendent, John Escalante, who knows of Beck through their memberships in several national policing organizations and thinks Beck will make a good fit for the city, even though he'll have to learn his way around and get up to speed on the community.
You really have to understand where the department is and where the city is right now, not just with the current issues, the last year or two of the consent decree, but you have to go back and look at the history of policing in Chicago and why there is mistrust with some parts of the city. So you have to do your homework. Chief Beck definitely, I think, will come in having done that.
Now, because Beck has said he's not applying for the job full-time, Escalante believes that he'll be able to help with the transition to the new permanent superintendent when the time comes. He adds that LA and Chicago share some similarities, like the issue of police-involved shootings and a consent decree, and he disputes the concerns raised by activists like Black Lives Matter.
I would say, you have to look at his overall record. And yes, they had some controversial shootings, but what did Chief Beck do to address those? What policy changes did he make? What outreaches to the community did he make? And I think that's where he showed he was a proven leader and tried to do the right things to make sure that the officers were using the proper amount of use of force.
Meanwhile, Beck is meeting with members of the department as well as the community and city council members to get up to speed. Police board has started its nationwide search. It will submit 3 nominees to the mayor who will make an appointment with city council approval. Phil.
Brandis, thank you. And now to Carol Moraine with more on the process to find the city's next police superintendent. Carol.
Phil, thank you. As we just heard from Brandis, Mayor Lightfoot's pick to replace Eddie Johnson with Charlie Beck on an interim basis has been drawing fire. But beyond Beck's expected short-term tenure, what about finding Johnson's long-term replacement? That task falls to the Chicago Police Board, Joining us now to help us understand the process is Guion Foreman, president of the Chicago Police Board. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Carol.
So, did you have any input with the mayor making this interim appointment? Did she consult with you?
No, not on the interim appointment. The police board, we're tasked with, because of the municipal code, we're tasked with identifying the 3 candidates, but not the interim candidate.
Have you met Charlie Beck?
Yes, we met last week on Friday at the press conference, but and also we had a meeting later with the department heads at City Hall on Friday afternoon.
How'd it go?
It was good. It was a good meeting. Got a chance to hear a little bit about his experience, about what he wants to bring to the city. With the meeting with the department heads, got an opportunity to see how CPD will have an opportunity to interact with all of the other departments around the city. And so it was a good start.
One of the questions that immediately arises is Eddie Johnson does not leave until January 1st, but Charlie Beck is coming in as an interim before. Can you have a current and an interim operating at the helm of the police department simultaneously?
That's probably a question not for the police board. That's outside the scope of what we do, so I can't really answer that one.
But it is not a bad question. You would agree that?
Yes, but I'm not even necessarily sure that there will be the 2 at the same time. So I can't answer that.
So how will this process unfold for you and the board?
Sure. So the board, we met last week, and we're going to be meeting again this week to kind of lay out the timeline, to think about what the process should look like, to think about the kind of community engagement we want to have. We want a good cross-section to hear from Chicago, police officers, community members, corporate citizens, because we all have a touch point with CPD. Right, so we want to understand best practices. We want to understand what is it that the department needs and what the city needs right now, so we can make the best informed choice for the 3 candidates that we will ultimately present to the mayor.
You've been on the police board this will be your 3rd one,
It's my
right?
3rd search, yes.
So the first search you were involved with ended up with Gary McCarthy, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then the second one ended up not with whom you picked, but rather Eddie Johnson.
Correct.
And so what have you learned from those 2 very different experiences, and what will it change for the next one?
Yeah, so first of all, I learned that this is a hard process. This is the 2nd largest department in the country, and that these searches take a lot of time. It takes a lot of input from a lot of people to really understand what are the issues. So when we think about best practices of hiring an executive, any executive, we have to take some of those things into concern. So really taking a listen and understanding where the department is right now. We're fortunate in that we have a group of experts in town because of the federal monitor, and they've been very helpful in terms of identifying best practices for other things. And we've reached out now and said, hey, we want help in identifying the kinds of qualities we should be looking for, what training one should have, and even what candidates we should be looking at. It helped to identify candidates around the country that we should be talking to.
Will you be talking to the police union?
Yeah, actually, I called Kevin Graham on Friday, right after we left the press conference, and said that I would like to set up an opportunity for the FOP to come and speak. I think that they're one voice of a lot of voices in Chicago, and I think that it would be a missed opportunity if we did not hear their voice. Not only a missed opportunity for the FOP, but a missed opportunity for the city.
And Kevin Graham and the union's point of view is that the best practices laid out in this consent agreement are not practices that they necessarily sign on to, correct?
Yes. Well, and Kevin and I, we have these kind of conversations regularly. It is what it is. We have the federal monitor here. They're using their thoughts and best practices. The judge is monitoring it. And so we are putting things in place to make the city better, to make the department better. So I like to deal with the world as it is.
What kind of input have you gotten thus far from the mayor herself?
First of all, that the process is going to work the way that it's intended to work. That first of all,
that means that she will not veto your 3 candidates as Rahm Emanuel did the last time.
Well, no, that's not necessarily true, right? The municipal code allows for the mayor to veto the 3 choices, and then we go back to the drawing board and select 3 more choices. So the mayor absolutely has the ability to veto the 3 choices.
Then let me reword that. She's not going to go over your head and pick someone you didn't pick. You're going to go back to the drawing board and pick 3 more.
That's correct. That's correct. And so the mayor made that very clear to me that the process would work the way that it's supposed to work. And that she wanted us to have full confidence that the city's resources were ours. So we talked about the fact that we want to go out into the community and hear from people. So she said, whatever resources we need as far as opening schools or city buildings, we absolutely had the ability to do that. To use some of the resources to make sure that we're touching every parts of Chicago, not just certain parts, but to make sure that we really hear from everyone. And she wants this process to have integrity. She said no leaks.
Well, integrity and no leaks are not always the same thing.
In the case of the police board, making sure that we act as a unit. The police board is 9 members, different parts of life, different parts of the city, different sets of experience, different race, age, gender. And so we each have a different set of experiences that we're bringing to the table. So to make sure that we can work with each other, not necessarily always agree, but that we can find a way to come to a solution that we're all happy with, and ultimately we'll end up with the 3 candidates.
How long will this take?
You know, it's hard to say, Carol. The process is going to take what it takes. I don't know who's going to apply. So it's difficult to say, but you know, our job is to present the 3 best candidates. We want to do a broad search. We want to reach out to the best candidates that exist across the country because our city deserves it.
How do you feel, just yourself personally, about whether an insider is an important choice versus an outsider?
You know, they each come with different pros and cons, right? So I'm agnostic to it. In the past 2 searches, I've seen incredible insiders and I've seen incredible outsiders. This is going to be a new search. I don't know who's going to apply. In any case, I know that we're going to see some really quality candidates, and each of them will have to stand on their own.
So there's no time frame per se, correct?
There's no time frame yet. The police board, this is really new, so we're going to get together again and kind of talk about what do we think is a realistic time frame. We hope to get an application out in the next couple of weeks, and we'll try to get through the process as efficiently as possible.
Charlie Beck seems to suggest that 1, he's not a candidate for the long term, and 2, it sounds like Mrs. Beck will have some input on the time frame as well. It can't, given all of this city's problems, take too long, can it? I mean, isn't there an urgency about this?
Absolutely, there's an urgency, and again, we're going to work through the process as efficiently as possible.
Chicago's reputation out there in the world, how do you think it will fare in terms of attracting candidates from across the country?
This is a great city, so I think absolutely. I mean, this is an opportunity that, you know, this is the 2nd largest city department in the country. And so from that perspective, if you're a law enforcement professional to be the chief executive of the 2nd largest department in the country, it's a great opportunity. Do we have challenges? Sure, but every department has challenges.
The Department of Justice, will it have any voice in this? I mean, you already have a consent agreement, but do you expect to hear from the feds on this at all?
I don't, not necessarily. I don't
or
know how they would.
solicit advice from them in terms of their own experience with policing?
Well, we have Maggie. We have Maggie here and the monitor team, and so they've been a wealth of knowledge for us so far in the process, and so I expect that we're going to continue to call on them for best practices and helping us to identify top candidates and to help us kind of think through what are the qualities that we should be looking for in a new leader for the department that will help us, you know, become the best department we could be.
I know you're looking for public input, but I'm wondering, will the public be able to observe in any way your own deliberations about who are the best candidates?
Yeah, so we haven't talked about that yet as a board. We've talked a little bit about it, just kind of saying, you know, when we talk about transparency, what does that mean? And so this is a part of what we as a board will figure out and try to see how exactly do we do that. You know, now there's a difference, Carol. If I were interviewing you and I sent your resume to MSNBC, you might not want the whole world to know that you applied for MSNBC. And so these are the kind of things that we have to take in consideration because we want the best candidates to apply.
And so, but the last couple of times, the public really didn't get to observe your deliberations, right?
No, so right, so all of this is done in executive session, and then when we are ready to present the 3 names, we'll do that in a public fashion.
Well, we look forward to continued discussion on it. Guian Foreman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Carol.
Much more ahead. Stay with us.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the City Club of Chicago.
Smart people may disagree about what makes a great city, but part of what makes Chicago great is that we don't have to agree. To run a city like ours, a lot of issues come up. The City Club of Chicago is a place to debate those issues and hear from the men and women who shape the policies, lead the industries, and tell the stories that define our city. For the free and open exchange of ideas, the City Club of Chicago.
Some palace intrigue as lawmakers head to Springfield. Paris Schutz has that story and more of what's making news in Chicago tonight. Paris.
Phil, Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan is taking more steps to ice out former state representative Luis Arroyo, who is facing a federal bribery charge. The speaker says Arroyo should have no role in picking a replacement to his former House seat. Arroyo has said that as committeeman of the 36th Ward, he would have the largest weighted vote to pick his successor. But in a statement, Madigan says, quote, any process that includes the participation of the 36th Ward, whether by direct vote or proxy, would call the legitimacy of the appointment into question, and the qualifications of their candidate would be challenged by the full Illinois House of Representatives. Governor Pritzker is also calling for the General Assembly not to sit any replacement picked by Arroyo. And Mayor Lightfoot says she's headed down to Springfield as lawmakers convene the final week of their fall veto session. Lightfoot appeared with Governor Pritzker today at Soldier Field for an event to celebrate Veterans Day. Among the mayor's agenda items, a reconstituted Chicago casino proposal and an authorization for a graduated city real estate transfer tax. Amanda Vinicky will have more on the veto session on Wednesday and more on Veterans Day later in the program. Rideshare giant Uber is going to the public to try and put the brakes on $40 million in new taxes proposed by Mayor Lightfoot. The mayor's proposed adding a downtown congestion zone fee and an extra fee on solo riders to help close the city's budget gap. Uber says it will launch a campaign to educate riders about the proposal, placing a link to more information at the bottom of every customer receipt. The company says the vast majority of riders throughout the city will see fee hikes as a result, not just solo travelers near downtown. And it's been a hairy day at Chicago's airports. O'Hare is averaging flight delays of more than an hour and a half, with more than 1,100 cancellations in the last 24 hours. Midway, meanwhile, is back to normal right now, with flights mostly on time and 98 total cancellations in the last day. And as for the weather, frigid tonight, clearing up with a low around 10. And then sunny skies tomorrow with a balmy high of 21. Now, Phil, back to you.
Balmy indeed. Thanks, Paris. Still to come on Chicago tonight. We have more on that unseasonably cold and snowy weather that Paris just mentioned. Black veterans find camaraderie at a Special American Legion post. WTTW's new documentary series looks at how gun violence affects Chicagoans and what some of them are doing to lessen it. Okay, Boomer, we discuss the internet meme pitting Generation Z against the generations that came before them. A gumball machine serves up poems, how these profits are funding a local arts nonprofit. And we hear your thoughts on the closing of a local record store in tonight's viewer feedback. But first, some of today's top business headlines. Here's Crane Chicago business editor Ann Dwyer.
Phil, Boeing still believes it can get permission before the end of the year to fly the 737 MAX again. Bloomberg reports the Chicago-based aerospace giant expects to resume deliveries of the plane as soon as December. Boeing stock jumped today on the news, putting it on track for the best day since June. The planes have been grounded since March because of two 737 MAX crashes that killed 346 people. Those crashes were tied to an automatic safety system on the plane. Meanwhile, the New York-based private equity giant KKR has approached Walgreens about a deal to take the drugstore chain private in what could be the biggest ever leverage buyout. Anonymous sources tell Bloomberg News that KKR has been preparing a proposal to buy out shareholders of Walgreens. It's unclear how feasible the transaction would be given the need for large amounts of financing, and Deerfield-based Walgreens and KKR could ultimately decide against pursuing a deal. And finally, Israel Adonijah is hoping to turn a few floors in a Loop office building into home base for Chicago's nonprofit sector. Expanding on an idea he's pursuing on the near South Side, the former Chicago Bears defensive end has leased 45,000 square feet at 200 West Madison Street for a venue meant to bring together philanthropic ventures. Framing it as a philanthropy innovation center set to open in March, Adonijah has subleased all of the available private offices to a series of charitable funds and foundations. For Crane's Chicago Business and chicagobusiness.com, I'm Ann Dwyer. Back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Ann. Did you know it's still technically fall for another 6 weeks? Not that you'd know it by looking outside. High winds and snow have blanketed the Chicago area in the past 24 hours, sending temperatures near record lows. So, what's behind this early winter weather, and what can we expect as the week goes on? Joining us now from the WGN Weather Center is meteorologist Demetrius Ivory. Demetrius, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me this evening.
First of all, what is going to be happening the rest of the week? What do we have to look forward to?
Well, I would say next week is what we need to look forward to because tonight it's going to get a little bit worse. We're expecting potentially a record in terms of cold weather tonight. The record low today is 15 degrees. Tonight we may drop to that 15 before midnight. So I got a low tonight going down to about 10 degrees and outlying areas around 8 or so. So we may get a record low tonight, and then a record low high comes our way tomorrow. That's kind of your coolest daytime, afternoon high temperature. We got 21 coming our way. The record low high right now is 28, so that gets smashed tomorrow.
Oh my goodness. So what is behind this this cold snap so early?
Well, we've seen a number of different blasts come in from the Arctic, and there's really nothing to cut it off. So when you're talking about low pressure system setting up to the northwest, it can really swing down those Arctic blasts, which is one is coming our way. As a matter of fact, some of the long range outlooks had to be kind of redone in the middle of last month in order to kind of make up for that big change that's come our way. So far, and today being the 21st day in a row where we've had colder than normal temperatures, this month going into today about 9.5 degrees colder than normal also. That's a deficit that you almost can't make up when you stretch it out over a month.
Tell us more about this Arctic blast. Exactly what is it and how is it formed?
Well, typically it's all about, I like to look at high pressure and low pressure as kind of gears in the atmosphere. There's a lot more that goes on to it. But I think that's one way of just kind of using that analogy of kind of describing it, and folks kind of get it. When you have a high pressure system, you have winds that turn in a clockwise fashion. When you have a low pressure system, you have winds that turn counterclockwise. So you can imagine if you have a low that's kind of sitting over the pole or just south and west of the pole, but north and west of us, that's going to swing winds in from the northwest. So in this case, we have the high, which is out to sea. We have a low, which is kind of, I'd say, almost due north. And they're working in tandem to just squeeze in that cold air coming in from the Northern Territory, from portions of Canada, and also, in some cases, from as far north as the Arctic.
So just how unusual is it to get this much snow and this much cold so early on?
Very unusual. As a matter of fact, this hasn't happened this early, this much snow this early, since the 1800s. How about that? Today's snow was a record, by early this afternoon, we had looked at about 3.4 inches of snow for O'Hare. The previous record was 1.9 inches, and that was set back in 1995. So we smashed that thing. Midway Airport, the previous record was 2.5 inches, again set back in 1995. We broke that by early this afternoon, 2.5. So, you know, when you talk about how unusual it is, it's actually never happened before on this date.
And we're also having high winds. What's the impact of those winds on the cold and on the snow?
So we're looking at the winds coming in at about 30 miles per hour or so. First off, what that does is immediately affect the wind chills. We've seen wind chill values down into the single digits throughout much of today. Tonight, I expect them to get well below zero. In many areas, maybe as low as minus 10. So that's when you're flirting with the dangerous category there. But then as you get into tomorrow, we're expecting for the winds to diminish some, gusting to around 20 miles per hour. What that's really doing is, again, making it quite uncomfortable outside for most folks out there. Dangerous if you're outside for way too long and underexposed. And it's really whipping up the waves along Lake Michigan. We are talking about the potential for 11-foot waves that are going to come our way. That's going to cause some great erosion there and also flooding all up along the lakeshore into today, tonight, and early tomorrow.
Demetrius, as we look ahead at the rest of the winter, is there any way to indicate how severe it's going to be, whether this is a precursor of just a really cold and snowy one?
Well, you know, I look back at last year, and last year we saw just about 12 inches of snow for November. But then nothing in December, 1.7 inches in December. So I've been forecasting winter snowfall for a long time. And I'll tell you, it comes down to just a series of events that eventually add up to the whole winter. So right now we don't expect for much of a change in terms of the temperature. And as long as the cold air is there, you know snow is a possibility. And I can tell you that cold air looks like it's going to be here for the next few weeks or so. So probably to carry us through the end of November. So this is certainly going to go down as a very snowy November. It may go down as the snowiest November on record. But that doesn't say much for December because, again, last year, 13 inches of snow for November, none for December. So there could be a pattern change that comes our way, you know, in the next couple of weeks or so. But right now, I can tell you we're going to be off to a really snowy start to winter. Last year, 49 inches of snow. That's about 15 more than normal. And a start like what we're looking at now will probably kick us above normal again this season.
Demetrius, thank you for bringing us up to date and letting us know what we do and do not have to look forward to. Thanks very much, buddy.
I always say I'm going to need witness protection after giving the forecast.
You'll be safe here if you want to come here. And we're back. We are back with more right after this.
Don't miss one of our stories. Get them all delivered to your desktop or mobile device with a subscription to the WTTW News Daily Briefing. Go to WTTW.com/Daily Briefing and sign up.
The American Legion was chartered by the U.S. government 100 years ago as a patriotic organization to serve veterans. One of its early chapters, Giles Post number 87, also celebrated its 100th anniversary this past August. The post holds a special legacy for African Americans. Chicago Tonight's Amanda Vinicky has more.
Even on this blistery day, members of the George L. Giles American Legion Post number 87 gathered to march down Martin Luther King Drive, as they have every Veterans Day. Conditions aren't what Legion Commander Ashley Shine Jr. had been hoping for, but then again, he's braved worse. Like back in 1966 when the Army sent him from Chicago to Korea.
It was a sterling shock for an 18-year-old person to go someplace that he has never seen. And Korea had to be, to me, as I was, I couldn't relate to it.
The veterans made their way to the Victory Monument at 35th and King Drive, a statue built to honor members of the Illinois National Guard's 8th Regiment, an African-American unit who died in France during World War I. A befitting Veterans Day journey, given that Post 87's namesake, Lieutenant George Giles, was one of those soldiers. Members of the unit who were lucky enough to return home weren't universally welcomed back as heroes. Black troops instead came home to racism, prejudice, discrimination, attitudes that triggered the 1919 race riots, attitudes which likely would have prevented most black veterans from being able to join a fledgling organization, the American Legion. Save for Lieutenant Earl Dickerson, that is. Per Legion lore, he chartered one of the nation's few chapters specifically for African American soldiers, named after the friend he'd lost in battle.
Knowing that at the time that was the only way we could have our own clubhouse to show that we served and we was proud of what we done, especially in World War I, we was real proud of what we had done. So he formed this post, and his vision was for us to have our own post. So wherever that you lived at in the country, and you was a minority and you wanted to be a part of the American Legion, they would automatically send you into Giles Post.
That practice caused the Giles Post to swell to more than 1,000 members at one time and to thrive. These ballers may be Harlem's now, but they got their start in Chicago.
The Harlem Globetrotters started out being the Giles 5. We were the first sponsor they ever had.
And for a long time, area youth were part of the Post's drum and bugle corps. They'd perform in early Bud Billiken parades.
A late grandfather of mine used to bring me down here when I was about 10 or 12 years old. He used to sit out there on the curb there and watch the Bud Billiken Gay parade back when I was a kid.
Back then, Harris never imagined joining the military himself, but the summer of 1971, he was due to be drafted, so he joined the Navy instead. He served the next 20 years.
It was always a black post.
Does that mean something to you?
Well, yes, if you can't get into the other places there because of your color, then you still believe in what you've done in regards to the military life. Yes, it means a lot.
He'd come by last week when I visited the Legion's longtime Bronzeville headquarters.
Just come in and have a few drinks and, you know, like I do all the time. This is my hand. Feel like it made me feel at home, which keeps me coming back.
Just look at the walls, he says, for a sense of the Post's history. The Giles Post is smaller than in its early heyday, but Commander Shine still says the Post plays an important role in the community.
Year-round, we try to find outreach programs for kids. Every time we get a chance, Easter, it doesn't make a difference. We're going to have a program for the kids.
Post 87 is raising funds right now to make repairs to its headquarters. The building needs a repaired roof, also tuck pointing. By next summer, they're also hoping to turn this vacant lot next door into a memorial park dedicated to its founder.
Shine says having an all-minority post isn't as important anymore.
It's not that important in this day and age. In 1919, it wasn't no other reality.
But it's every bit as important for veterans to have a place where they can be together, a clubhouse of their very own, a place that means something.
We've been around a long time, and the people that went before us made it possible for us to be here. This property belongs to us, the veterans of this post. We are the ones right now that's watching it for the ones that comes after us.
Perhaps some of the Chicago Military Academy cadets who marched behind the Giles veterans this snowy morning will help to carry on that legacy for the Post's next 100 years. For Chicago Tonight, I'm Amanda Vinicky.
According to the U.S. Census, 12% of veterans are black. There are approximately 18 million military veterans in the United States. For some in Chicago, gun violence is a remote and often abstract problem, something that usually affects other people in other neighborhoods. But for many Chicagoans, gun violence is an unavoidable part of their lives. A new WTTW digital series follows the stories of 5 people whose lives have been touched by that violence and shows why their stories matter. Let's take a look.
I started volunteering with a friend of mine. She asked me to come out. Let's do this march. To stop the violence. So it started with the volunteering, the marching, the sharing my son's story. You know, noticing that there was so many families out there, that the killings in Chicago was really serious, and that our families are seriously suffering.
Joining us now is Dan Protest, producer of the new WTTW series, Firsthand Gun Violence. Dan, tell us about the clip we just saw.
So that's Noemi Martinez. She lost her son 15 years ago and vowed through gun violence and vowed to help others like herself. And so she started working for an organization called Chicago Survivors and runs support groups, also goes to crime scenes to help families break the news to them, you know, really difficult, challenging work, especially in light of the fact that she's been through it herself. But she's one of 5 people who I followed for this project, day in, day out. got to know these people really well, and through this documentary, our audience will get to know them as well.
And what inspired this documentary?
So, I mean, obviously there's plenty of coverage of gun violence, but my concern has always been that it's almost like akin to sports coverage. It's like, what was last night's score? How many people were shot? How many people were killed? And I feel like often the human beings are missing from that coverage, and I wanted to really get to know, how did this impact someone like Noemi? How did it impact someone like Julie Anderson, whose son killed 2 young women? How did it impact her 10, 15 years down the line? And also, what's going through the mind of someone as they're about to pull the trigger? And perhaps maybe that starts to shed light on what we could do to stop that person from pulling the trigger.
Let's take another look at the series. Here's more.
This was actually where I got shot. I was coming to my car. As I was turning off the car, and I heard the first shot. I'm looking. I didn't react. You know what I'm saying? I didn't react because I just thought it was like, damn, like, I don't know. It's 4th of July time, you know, firecrackers still going. So then I just hear da, 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 da. Turned around this way, got shot in the back of the leg. As I got up, the blood just felt like, I'm like, oh yeah, something ain't right. Had to wrap my leg and then just take me to the hospital. I had to get 2 blood transfusions, you know, because it hit a major vein from my heart to my foot. I remember me telling the nurse that if I pass away, just tell my mom it's not her fault.
Tell us more about his story. He refers to his mother, and as I recall from the clip, wasn't she a college graduate?
Absolutely, and Jerron himself had 3 years of college, SIU, Carbondale, fell just short of graduation. Really promising, really smart young guy who got involved with a street organization at a young age and was shot a couple of summers ago. And so we kind of followed him as he healed from that gunshot wound, but also just kind of explored with him how that feels to be shot both physically and psychologically. Obviously, there's a lot of fear there, and born out of that fear is he feels like he needs to carry a gun to protect himself, to feel safe. And that obviously then makes him vulnerable to law enforcement. And then we followed him as he was facing a gun charge and possibly facing 3 years in prison.
As I saw clips from the series this afternoon, I couldn't help but be impressed by the emotional access that people gave you into what they experienced. How did you do that?
Just old-fashioned time, just spending a lot of time with these people. Even before I showed up with the camera, I really got to know these people, had meals with them, and then just spent enough time with them and my camera person to make sure that, they felt comfortable with us and our camera and were willing to open up to us. And also, I mean, people want to share their stories, and especially these 5 people understand that they can shed light on an issue that's really plagued this city and hopefully can maybe move the needle in terms of doing something to prevent future violence.
Dan, let's take another look at a clip from firsthand.
We sent our kids to a Catholic school.
First communion.
Yeah. We both worked. We're still married.
Eric is a Cub Scout.
We were middle class, and I tried to raise my kids right, and you can do everything right. And things go off the rails. Bad things happen to good people. Someone told me that once, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna take that and run with it. Bad things can happen to good people.
And you alluded to this, but tell us what the bad thing was that happened to these good people.
So, and obviously many people whose kids commit heinous crimes are good people, and many people who commit heinous crimes are good people. But in the case of Julie and her husband Rick, their son, when he was 15 years old, got involved in a gang, and this took them completely by surprise. They lived in Clearing on the southwest side, very middle-class neighborhood, lots of police officers and firefighters, and he stole a gun and shot 2 young women and killed them, and he was given life without parole at 15. And then Julie, to her credit, rallied around her son and took up the cause of the people she refers to as the voiceless, of prisoners.
And you point out, well, I don't want to give too much away about what happens, but another interesting side note is that Eric's father, the young man who shot those two girls, he himself is a police officer.
He was a police officer at the time, and so in the middle of the night, his former partner comes to his door and knocks on the door and says, you know, there was a murder in the neighborhood and we think your son was responsible.
And in fact, he was. Here's one more clip from the series. Let's watch.
I thought about not going to prom because I feel like it's not fair that my friend was most excited about prom and then she got killed on her way to get a prom dress. One of my best friends, she was killed in March. Really? What happened? She was shot in her back. Oh my gosh. But I know she would want all of us to go and have a good time. She was pronounced dead on the 13th. She would be so excited because it's here, like this is what we've been waiting for.
This young woman was, what, getting ready for prom? Why did you include her? Her name is India.
Yeah, India Hart's story just really epitomizes what I was trying to do with this series, which is her life is so familiar to so many of us. She was in high school, it was her senior year. We followed her to prom, we followed her to graduation, and then off to college a few weeks ago. And so her life is so familiar, and yet so much of it is so foreign to many of us, in that her dad was shot right in front of her, her uncle was killed, and she lost a close friend, as you just heard, this year. And I think I feel like we have a real empathy gap in this city. I feel like we just don't really completely identify with the people who are living these dramas every day. And my hope is that by presenting our audience with these familiar stories, we can get them to empathize a little bit more with people who are living very familiar lives to our own, but yet are dealing with extreme violence in their communities.
Dan, a remarkable series. Congratulations on work well done, you and your camera people. Well done. Again, WTTW's new digital series, Firsthand Gun Violence, premieres tomorrow. You can find the series by visiting WTTW.com/firsthand. And join us tomorrow night for a special edition of Chicago Tonight on gun violence. We'll meet some of the documentary subjects and talk with community leaders and elected officials about this issue. And we are back in a moment, so please stay with us.
Don't ever miss Chicago Tonight. Subscribe to our podcast. Get a daily download of our show delivered to your desktop or mobile device. Go to WTTW.com/Chicago Tonight podcast and subscribe.
When older generations judge young people, not that it happens very often, it may start with a cliche like back in my day or end with you have it easy now. Well, young people have found a snappy retort. Okay, boomer. The meme has taken off on social media in recent weeks, particularly among members of Generation Z. Those are people born on or about 1997, according to the Pew Research Center. Whether someone's trying to be funny or serious, OK Boomer may be underscoring deeper generational divides. And joining us is Kathleen O'Shea. She's content manager for the PR firm 3 Points and board member of the weekly tech event Chi Hack Night. And Kathleen O'Shea, welcome to Chicago Tonight. Summarize a little bit more what OK Boomer means.
Yeah, so OK Boomer is basically, like you said, it's a retort, and it is pretty snappy. It's a way of responding to critiques, either explicit or implicit, of the way that Generation Z and millennials in general live their lives and the things that they value.
So in other words, if a boomer, somebody my age or thereabouts, says something critical or judgmental or not inclusive, someone could very easily say to me,
OK Boomer. Yeah, that's basically it. Because you also don't have to be a boomer to receive that.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Where did the term come from? I mean, how did that come to be, this phrase?
Yeah, I think it became really popular on social media as more and more, I think Generation Z saw examples of times where perhaps boomers and maybe Generation X, and probably also sometimes millennials, I'll have to ask someone from Generation Z, where it seemed like they were out of touch with the things that were important to members of Generation Z.
In fact, before you go any further, let's go over the 4 generations because you're alluding to them, and let's take a look because baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. Generation X, born between 1965 and 1980, Millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, and Generation Z, the youngest, the folks we're talking about right now, born in 1997 to the present. And these classifications, again, come from the Pew Research Centers. Do these generations have unique identities?
I'd say definitely. I think that there's a lot to be said for the experiences that each generation goes through. And sometimes, even if it is the same event going on, I think that each generation is experiencing it differently. So, for instance, even though Millennials and Generation X and baby boomers were all around for 9/11, it was a really different experience for Millennials versus those other two. And Generation Z, that's just multiplied even more because they probably weren't even really, they would have still been in, say, preschool or kindergarten when 9/11 happened.
Some baby boomers have taken exception with with that phrase, "Okay, boomer," and they see it as something akin to ageism. Is it that harsh?
I think it's pretty lighthearted. I do think that...
Lighthearted?
Yeah, I hope that people aren't too offended by it, but I do think it's meant to be a joke. It's not meant to be a slur in any way. I do think that, keeping in mind that Generation Z, they're all below the age of 22. When you say something when you're below the age of 22, it may not be as well thought out always as something that you might say as an adult. But I do think that it is meant in good fun in some ways, but I do think that at the core there is a real critique there.
And what's the nature of the critique?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with the issues that Generation Z and Millennials too are facing as a result of actions taken or not taken by earlier generations.
For example?
Climate change is a really big one because we're talking about decades and decades of inaction on reducing the carbon footprint, and even when there was some understanding of the dangers that pollution causes, there wasn't really much done about it. Gun control is another really big one. The economy, all these things in general.
Student debt is probably another one.
Exactly, that's huge. And as a result, people are saying, okay, boomer, because there's this sort of feeling that, well, you don't really understand the way that your action or inaction has caused us to face these challenges and have to try and find ways to deal with them.
So in other words, the person who might say that thinks, you don't get what you have done to me, and you're not acknowledging it even.
Yeah, yeah.
And what do you say though for boomers and maybe even millennials who look at Generation Z and might say something like, oh, go have some avocado toast or something like that?
Well, I'd say that priorities are really different. I think that maybe at the heart of this misunderstanding is a feeling that people in older generations maybe don't understand why you might want to buy avocado toast instead of a house. Like maybe you feel more secure in some ways going and buying a piece of avocado toast than saving up to buy a house, because it seems like it's already insurmountable in so many ways because it's so expensive, and you're also at the same time dealing with this wage inequality and other things that you have to spend money on.
Because there are some other epithets that baby boomers can fling at young people, calling young people snowflakes or whatever. How much cross-generational interaction is there in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you look. I think in some ways, a lot of this okay boomer stuff that's been going on has been happening on maybe social media platforms that older people aren't necessarily on or on as much. For instance, like TikTok.
You won't see much of it on Facebook, for example.
Probably a fair bit less, which is where, boomers and Generation X, they tend to be more present. They tend to be more active there. So I do think that maybe the conversation isn't happening there, but I do think that increasingly the conversation will have to be in order for the differences to be surmounted and for some kind of resolution to take place.
Kathleen O'Shea, thanks for giving us, lifting up the rock and letting us look underneath to see what's going on there. Very much appreciated. If you ever spent any time as a kid at the Chicago Cultural Center, then you might remember the Art-O-Mat machine that gave you a piece of art for the price of 2 tokens. Now that machine has inspired a new one. Arts correspondent Angel Ito introduces us to a gumball machine that isn't exactly serving up your favorite flavor of Bubblicious, but rather a poem.
We set out from the porch stairs, the shush of cars on Cicero Avenue.
For poet Yvonne Zipter, what originally started as a creative way to enhance the art in her neighborhood has since turned into a small business that helps support mural upkeep around the city.
Now, there isn't too much that you can buy for 50 cents nowadays, but here at a local bookstore, 2 quarters is all you need for exactly 1 poem.
The poetry machine, as Zipter calls it, was inspired by a vending machine at the Cultural Center that dispensed a piece of art for 2 tokens. She took the idea to Arts Alive Chicago founder Sid Smiley and suggested it as a way to add a written element to the art going up around her neighborhood. With the help of Arts Alive Chicago, the poetry machine traveled to schools and to local businesses. And as the popularity grew, Zipter and Smiley realized the success of the machine was much bigger than either could have imagined.
I put my own poems in it, just the published ones, and then I was saying to Sid, there was a time in my life where I thought, well, this would be like a nice little source of extra income. But I'm in a place in my life right now where I don't really need the money that would come from the machine, and so I decided to donate it, and the logical place to do that was Arts Alive.
There are 2 poetry machines that sit at Women and Children First Bookstore and Eris Brewery and Cider House. In the past year, those 2 machines have made $1,000, averaging about 96 poems a month. Now the money goes toward mural upkeep around the city and to create new murals.
I was doing a mural project at Hibbard Elementary, which is in Albany Park, and one of the teachers came over to me and said, I have a student who's very shy, but he did a drawing I think is neat, and he's kind of insecure, and I was wondering if maybe you would just talk to him about his art. And it was really unique and very impressive, so I asked if he wanted to maybe turn it into a mural, and he was very excited, and so we worked together on making it a mural. Those funds were because of this project.
As the poetry machine heads into its 8th year, Zipter says she's grateful for the opportunity to encourage her community to express themselves through their art.
The possibility that the poetry machine might be piquing people's curiosity about poems and opening them up to the idea of reading poetry or maybe even writing poetry. I really like that. You know, it's very fun to know that people around the city are buying my poems, but really I'm hoping that it will open them up to poetry of all kinds. I mean, who would think poetry would be a moneymaker?
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Angel Ito.
The poetry machine sells poems at 50 cents a pop at Women and Children First Bookstore in Andersonville and Eris Brewery and Cider House in Irving Park. Before we go, some viewer feedback. Our story on a plan to open a zero-waste, bring-your-own-container grocery store in Chicago drew these comments. I would welcome this in Pilsen. Grew up getting dairy delivered to our home and would return the empty glass bottles each week. The liquids could have a system such as that. I don't mind paying a little more for that instead of sending all these containers to the garbage. Many stores have offered self-serve bulk food options, but theft and dirty hands have often played roles in ending the practice. This sounds like my new heaven. And news that long-standing record store Valhalla is closing at the end of the month had some of you reminiscing about the store in Oak Park and interacting with its owner, the late Val Camilletti. Took my son there when he was like 6 years old. He bought an Elvis Presley white double CD. It was the place to go. Rest in peace, Val, and your music shop. I guess the handwriting was on the wall, stylus on the vinyl, ever since she died, but I'm still so sad to hear that Val's Holla is closing. Val's was a touchstone to the other world of music for me. That is, everything of music other than what I already knew. Val was a musical well of plumbless depth. At least half my vinyl collection was of secondhand discs, $2 each from her store. As always, we appreciate hearing from you. Join the discussion on Facebook and Twitter, or post your comments on our website. And that is our show for this Monday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night live at 7. WTTW launches its digital series, Firsthand Gun Violence. We'll meet some of the Chicagoans whose stories are featured and talk with local leaders and scholars about ways to address the crisis. We leave you tonight with more of Chicago's 100th Veterans Day Parade. Now, for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Phil Ponce. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices. Robert Clifford is the honoree of this year's Illinois Bar Foundation's annual fundraising event that raises money to enhance the availability of justice for those without attorneys throughout the state.